Would Professor Julio Samso please come over to present his topic on Dunash ibn Tamim and the Armillary sphere.
This morning, David King was remembering the time where we met in Aleppo, David, George Saliba, and myself. And he has depicted us as if we were three panda bears. To tell you the truth, there was something I discovered in that trip to Aleppo, was the fact that everybody was working on Eastern astronomy, and nobody was doing anything about the Western part of the world. And I decided this was a turning point in my life to begin working on Andalusian materials. And after a certain number of years, I decided I have more or less seen all the available Andalusian materials, and I had to turn to the Maghreb. And I began working on the Maghreb. The situation of the history of astronomy in the Maghreb, for me, is fairly clear between the 13th and 15th century. But before that date, there's practically no information. The fact that I knew that there was a treatise on the Armillary sphere written by a 10th century Jew, Dunash ibn Tamim, preserved in a manuscript in Istanbul. And this was known because in 1956, in his festschrift for Millas Vallecrosa, the master of my master, Stern had published a prologue to this text. And this prologue attracted my attention. And I thought that obtaining a manuscript from Istanbul libraries was not so easy. But I was lucky enough because my friend and colleague, Mr. Gomez, who died 5 years ago, actually had a photocopy of the Istanbul manuscript at home. And her twin sister told me that she had that manuscript, she passed it to me. Then I was able to have a look at the text. When one looks at this text, no? Okay, let's see if this thing works. Okay. And there is a history before Dunash ibn Tamim concerning Armillary spheres. Abbas ibn Nasif, Firnas, built one for Amir Abdurrahman II, and this is in the first half of the 9th century. But later, Dunash ibn Tamim wrote the first known Maghribi treatise on the use of the instrument, and he offered it in 955, together with a small Armillary sphere, to the Sheikh Abul Hassan Muhammad ibn Hussein, who is supposed to have been the governor of Mahdia. Who probably was the governor of Mahdia. And this text is the text, and there is also a later tradition. Ibn Zarqallo, for example, wrote a treatise on the construction of the instrument, which is only preserved in the Castilian Al-Furqān translation. Together with the treatise on the use of the instrument is not Ibn Zarqallo, it's probably the result of the collaborators of King Alfonso. And much later, in 14th century, Ibn Azus al-Constantini used an Armillary sphere for observations he made in Fez in the 14th century. So there is a certain history of the instrument in this, for example, is Ibn Zarqallo's Armillary sphere, which was probably an instrument of a certain size. And some years ago, George Saliba published a paper in Alcantara, in which he gave notice about a new manuscript he had discovered, and which contained a part which was it was written by a contemporary of Ibn Zarqallo in the 11th century. And he says that Ibn Zarqallo had some problems of stability with his instrument. Having problems of stability implies in principle to use a big-sized instrument. And I believe that this instrument was probably the Armillary sphere, which we know only through the Castilian Al-Furqan translation. But there are many different types of armillary spheres. The kind of armillary sphere used for observation is usually more simple than that. This is Tumer's reconstruction of Ptolemy's armillary sphere, as it was known. I have seen also reconstructions of Copernicus' armillary sphere, and it's very similar to this one. But there are also huge armillary spheres. This comes from a Turkish manuscript, and it depicts the astronomers of the Istanbul Observatory with an enormous armillary sphere, which I believe is a product mainly of fancy. I don't think such enormous thing ever existed, but it is nice to see it. There were big armillary spheres existing. Others were smaller, and they were not used for actual observation. This one is an armillary sphere kept at the Oxford Museum of History of Science, which is Italian, beginning of the 16th century. And this kind of instrument is no longer used for observation. It's used as a demonstration instrument, a didactical kind of instrument used to teach elementary spherical astronomy, using this as a model. And some of these instruments are even portable. For example, this, and actually Dunash ibn Tamim, when he describes his instrument, he says that it has a hanger, an alaka, on top of it, and that the user of the instrument must suspend it from the alaka with his right hand, and then use his left hand to manipulate the instrument. This kind of instrument was the kind of instrument probably described by Dunash. It is interesting, the figure. He flourished in Fatimid Tunis in the 10th century. He was a disciple of a famous physician, Ishaq ibn Suleiman al-Israeli, and he was physician of the Fatimid caliphs. And this fellow wrote some astronomical works. He dedicated, and this is interesting because he dedicated an astronomical book to Hasaim Shaprut, who was the physician of Abdurrahman III in Cordoba, and it contained 3 parts. The first one on Haya, the second on mathematical astronomy, and the third on astrology. And also we know that he wrote another book on the structure of the spheres, Hayat al-Aflaq, for the Fatimid Caliph al-Mansur Ismail ibn al-Qaim. And Taro Mimura, a Japanese scholar, has recently identified the Arabic text and the Latin translation of the book on Haya, previously attributed to Mashallah. What I want to underline here is that one of my hypotheses is the arrival of Eastern materials to Cordoba in the 10th century, in the 9th and 10th century, comes mainly through Kairouan. I mean, Kairouan is the midpoint through which Eastern material reaches Cordoba. And here we have an instance in the fact that Dunash ibn Tamim wrote a book and dedicated it to Hasaim Shaprut. And this shows us a little bit how the circulation of information was moving. In his treatise on the armillary sphere, he also mentioned other works which apparently are not extant. One of them is the Risala fi al-Furqān ala khuruj Markaz al-Shams and Markaz al-Kull bidarajatain wa nisf, proof of the sun's eccentricity of 2.5 degrees in respect to the center of the world, which this is the Ptolemaic value for the solar eccentricity. And he also explained that he made a disc or a round table, he says a sufra, on which there was a map of the earth for our Lord and Sovereign, he says Ila Maulana wa Sayyidina, and he wrote a book explaining how the disc should be made. The dedicatee could be Al-Qaim ibn al-Mahdi or his son Al-Mansur Ismail ibn al-Qaim. The fact is that we have no serious information on astronomy in the Maghreb until the 7th, 13th century, with 2 exceptions. One is Dunash himself, and the other is Ibn Abi Rijal. And both have surprising information about very rare kinds of instruments discovered in the East, and they have arrived somehow to them. And we have examples in the prologue itself. In the prologue of the book on the Armillary sphere, and this is the edition that was made by Stern in 1956, he speaks of something which he calls the astrolabe al-munbatah, which is probably al-mubatah, which is the melon-shaped astrolabe that was studied some years ago at one of the last productions of Professor Kennedy, together with Richard Lorch, and discovered this kind of the melon-shaped astrolabe, which obviously is not a circle, but rather it has the shape near an ellipse. It's a melon. And there is another allusion in our text. Oh, no. He says another kind of astrolabe, he names astrolabe al-Houti, the fish-shaped astrolabe. Other sources talk about astrolabe samaki, but I mean the impression is the same. And this is another kind of rare astrolabe which has been studied by Richard Lorch, for example, and which we have here a diagram of what it looks like. Now, Dunash ibn Tamim, رسالة العمل بذات الحق, extant in manuscript Istanbul, Hagia Sophia, dedicated to the Sheikh Abul Hassan Muhammad bin Hussein, probably the governor of Mahdia, and the result of a visit to Abul Hassan residence in Mahdia, during which they talk about sophisticated astrolabes and the Baida. And the Baida is makes me think of Al-Batani's sphere, which is a kind of sophisticated instrument. And all this implies the knowledge of certain things coming from the East at that time. This is the Baida of Al-Batani as reconstructed by Naleno in his edition. And as a consequence of this meeting, Abul Hassan asked Dunash to build for him a Baida or an Armillary sphere, one of the two instruments. And he finally built the Armillary sphere because he considered it to be a more complete kind of instrument. It was built with the help of some artisans sent by Abul Hassan, and Dunash wrote the epistle on the description and use of the instrument to accompany his gift of the instrument itself, which he gave to. The Risala is divided into three parts, which they call funun. The introduction, he explains the great circles of the celestial sphere, and there is a long and confusing description of the rings which appear in the Armillary sphere. And then there are 43 chapters on the use of the instrument, most of them being standard applications of analogical computers like the astrolabe or the celestial globe for problems of spherical astronomy. Many digressions, especially related to higher, unrelated to the instrument itself, and very little use of the instrument for observations. I mean, his treatise on the Armillary sphere, his main purpose is to offer the governor of Mahdia some information on the how to represent on the sphere the celestial motions, and thus give him an instrument that allows him to understand better the astronomical problems and how to solve them. There is a third part which is missing in the manuscript. Only chapter 1 of the third section, which deals with mathematical geography, appears between chapters 21 and 29 of the second section. He gives information about the prime meridian of the Fortunate Islands, Al-Jazair al-Khalidat, or from the cities in the Sea of Tangier, which begins in the bronze idols, Al-Asnam and Nukhas. And these are idols that traditionally are ascribed to the Isle of Cadiz. Actually, the city of Cadiz, if you ever go there, it is not an island, it's a peninsula with only there is a road that connects it to the mainland. And it is interesting talking about this meridian, which I have never seen elsewhere. He gives information about the measurement of 1 degree of the meridian made in the time of Caliph al-Ma'mun. He uses the value 66 and 2/3 miles for the degree of the meridian, which is obviously not the result of the measurement made by astronomers of Al-Ma'mun, but are sort of reconstruction of the Ptolemaic, translation of the Ptolemaic 180,000 stadia with an erroneous factor of conversion of 7.5 miles per stadium. He deals with the determination of the longitude of a city. One is the standard one, simultaneous observation of 2 lunar eclipses and establishing the hour-to-time difference between the 2 observations. And the other is an extremely crude method based under the reduction of itinerary measures, which are simple applications of the Pythagorean relation and considering the Earth as being completely plane. It is rather good. The sources he mentions are Ptolemy's geography, the Almagest, the handy tables. Is he using the sources directly or only indirectly? One doesn't know. Unidentified Zijes, but specific mention of the Mumtahan Zij. And this is something that attracts my attention because the Mumtahan Zij is not a very common Zij used in Al-Andalus. Actually, the only source that proves the use of this, the knowledge of this dish, is Ibn al-Kammad. Ibn al-Kammad al-Zij al-Muktabas. Chabas and Goldstein have proved that there is a lot of information that comes from the Mumtahan. But for the rest, I know if somebody else knows anything about Andalusia or Maghrebi sources quoting the Mumtahan Zij, I would very much appreciate to communicate me the information. A geographical book by Al-Kindi, and Thabit ibn Qurra is mentioned in the definition of the Samt, the Azimut. The rings are described in a most confusing way. I mean, there are 9 rings, of which 6 can easily be identified. But there are 3 which are extremely confusing because the information it gives in different parts of the book are absolutely contradictory. I'm not going to insist on this. There is a Tata Ilakak, which is a meridian ring, clearly. The user, the instrument, should hang it with his right hand. Halkat al-Falak al-Mustaqim or al-Muqtarid al-Tata Ilakak, which is clearly the equator. Halkat al-Ufq, or is a horizon ring, and a movable ring whose axis links the north and the south pole of the equator. But as for the 5th is the Hamilton al-Buruj, which is the ecliptic ring, clearly. Another one, Halkat al-Buruj, ring of the zodiacal sign. The first was not the ecliptic, it was an ecliptic meridian ring. And 3 others which are extremely confusing, and I cannot. If somebody wants to help me, I will send him the whole text, and I will be. But both Taro Mimura and I myself have been discussing on this problem, and none of us has reached any clear conclusion. The instruments are very rarely used for observations, and none of the rings has a pair of sides, which is obvious if you want to use the rings for observations. When an observation is needed, the author recommends the use of an astrolabe or another instrument like a graduated gnomon. For the determination of the latitude of a city, precise observations require the use of great instruments having large diameter. Says alalat arizam al-wasi al-aqtar. So observation is not considered. What is the Armillary sphere? Actually, like the astrolabe, is a computing device that can be used to solve problems of spherical astronomy. Dunash, however, favors the use of the astrolabe for that kind of purpose. And it is frequently used as a demonstrational instrument for teaching elementary spherical astronomy. And quite often, the use of the armillary sphere is quite unnecessary. He explains a computation and somehow tries to use the armillary sphere to explain how to use it, although this is not very successful. Was Dunash competent as an astronomer? I doubt it. I doubt it seriously. He seems to be an amateur, mainly interested in simple cosmology, Haya, a topic which frequently appears in his digressions. He does not seem to know the standard astronomical terminology, and quite often makes a mess with the technical terms he uses. For example, he doesn't know the difference between the right ascensions and oblique ascensions. And he speaks of right ascensions when he is actually using oblique ascensions, obviously. And the Risala is a good example of a very primitive stage in the development of astronomy in the Maghreb. There must have been something else, but right now the sources are entirely unknown to me. I don't have astronomical sources from the 10th or 11th or 12th century made in the Maghreb. In the future, if someone has access to Maghrebi library, maybe one will someday discover something else. And thank you very much.